Hi, I'm Manda McKay. I'm a professional artist and I'm making these videos to give you tips to help enhance your creativity regardless of your level of expertise. For this video, I'm going to be talking about a tip that actually I think started out as an insult towards me a long time ago. But this was I think it was in a literature class in high school. I was 13 and the teacher made an observation, let's say, about my buddy Frank and me, and we thought it was an insult at the time, not really sure. But she said that Frank and I were like sponges. And of course we were kind of like, what? And she continued and said that we were just sitting there absorbing knowledge like a sponge. And the fact that she said that in front of the whole class and was kind of calling us out was extremely awkward for us. We did not like to be the center of attention, and I think that's one reason why we took it as an insult. But we talked about it afterwards, and really, whether or not it was an insult, saying that we were just sponges absorbing things was only part of the picture, because we were actually really active in the class. We weren't just sitting there passively all the time, which is why it was kind of weird for her to say that. We would participate in class discussions, and a lot of times we would be the ones sort of leading the discussions when other people in the class were kind of afraid to say what they thought about the poem or the short story or whatever. But yeah, we talked about it afterwards, and it wasn't necessarily untrue, but it wasn't a bad thing, we decided, because yeah, we would learn. That's really what she was talking about. We would sit there and learn, and we would absorb all that knowledge like a sponge. But then at some point, we would essentially squeeze out that mental sponge and have something, whether it was in the discussion or in an essay or a test or whatever. So we did not think this was a bad thing. But I kept thinking about that over the intervening years, and that really this is good for either, not just for creativity, for academic courses as well, just anything where you're trying to learn something and then later come up with something from what you learned or were inspired by. And it's just a matter of input versus output, really. So we would be the sponges absorbing all the information, and that was the input, and then at some point was the output where we took what we had learned and made something out of it. So as far as creativity in specific, what this would mean is, again, it's input and output. You're probably at some point you're learning, you're absorbing either something that's informative or that you find inspiring, and not necessarily in whatever field of art you have or whatever your type of creative hobby is. It could be from something totally different, but to just be taking in information and inspiration all the time is great. And if you're really experienced at this, of course, creativity, like anything else, will improve with practice. If you're experienced with this, then you probably have a pretty good ratio of input to output. But if you don't, and especially if you're starting out, don't get discouraged and just trust the process and trust the timeline. Because when I switched with, I'm predominantly an oil painter, but a long time ago, I was basically painting horses. And then I switched to something completely different. I wanted to have something that was a bit more meaningful and maybe even a bit political. And eventually I switched to painting still lifes of assembled natural objects. So it was very different. But it actually took a long time where I had decided that I was dissatisfied with the one thing that I was doing, and then trying to come up with what was my next direction going to be, because I knew it needed to be a huge switch. And so it really took me a few years of having to be that sponge and absorb information and inspiration before I was able to come up with this thing that was totally different. And it did wind up being something that's different from anything. The output is very different from any input I ever had. I haven't really seen anything else that's exactly what I'm doing now, but it took me a long time to get there. And like I said, it just took kind of years and just absorbing like a sponge anything that inspired me artistically. And then eventually I was able to come up with something just completely different and completely new. So trust that process. Be a sponge as long as you need to be, absorb as much as you need to, and don't worry about the timeline. And eventually, like I said, you'll be able to squeeze out that mental sponge and get some output from all of that input that you've absorbed. So what do you think? Was the teacher insulting me and insulting Frank? Or was she just making an observation and not making it as an insult or a compliment? What do you think? I'd be curious because, again, after all these years, I still haven't figured out what exactly she meant by that. But thank you, Mrs. Sprouse, because whatever your intent was, this turned out to actually be a really good way of looking at things and of looking at learning, and I still use it today. And so I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know what you think. Again, my name is Manda McKay, and thank you so much for watching.